So in this module, what we're going to look at is the Informatica Big Data Management architecture. What I would like to do is I'd like to give an overview of the Informatica platform, the components that are associated with the platform, and the reason behind this is because I want you to understand the different types of components that make up the Informatica architecture platform and how these interact with the Hadoop cluster. We'll look at connectivity specifically around PowerExchange for HDFS and PowerExchange for Hive. And these are the two most common data stores that our customers are leveraging. So I want to give you a quick overview of the PowerExchange adapters. We'll talk about data integration on Hadoop. This is the component where you're actually processing data on the Hadoop cluster, right? So if I build a mapping, how does it actually execute on the Hadoop cluster? And then finally, we'll look at port connectivity for BDM and Hadoop. Again, this will high-level overview of the interaction that occurs between the big data management server, the Informatica server, and the Hadoop cluster. So what are the unit objectives, right? So at the end of this course, what I want you to understand is the Informatica platform, the architecture around it, the connectivity between Hadoop, HDFS, and Hive, how big data management connects to these two data stores. I want to understand polyglot computing concept. And the idea here between polyglot is understanding how Informatica interacts or supports multiple languages, right? So if you recall in the Hadoop 101 basics, we talked about MapReduce as a processing language. So how does Informatica support MapReduce, Hive on TAS, Blaze, Informatica Blaze Compute Engine, and then also how to integrate with Spark. And then finally, again, understand high-level connectivity between big data management and the Hadoop cluster. So let's start by looking at some definitions that we'll use throughout this particular module, right? So we'll start looking at a domain. So what is a domain? So a domain is a collection of nodes and services that define what an Informatica environment is. And a domain could include like all the services that we'll talk about, the repository, the integration services that are associated with it. So think about domain as like the brains behind the entire platform, right? It manages all these services within the Informatica platform. Now, the administrator tool is the web UI tool that I'll use to manage the domain, right? So I'll go through it here in a second. I'll show you what this looks like. But think of domain as the main repository that manages all the services within the domain, right? So these are all the services we'll talk about, the application services, and all the nodes within the domain. And it's managed through the Informatica Administrator tool. And a node is nothing more than a logical representation of a machine, right? So I could have within my domain, and this gets a little bit more complicated, and we won't cover this, but this covers like the grid processing aspect of which Informatica supports. But here we're looking at a node, right? And node, again, is nothing more than just a logical representation of a machine. So I could have one server. On this server, I could install the Informatica domain, and I could also stand up services, right? The repository services, the data integration services. Now, if I scale this out in terms of grid computing, I can add multiple nodes to that particular domain, and I can say node 1, node 2, and I can stand up services on these nodes as well. And each node runs a service manager. Service manager basically runs or manages the services on all of these nodes, right? So I'm not going to go through in detail of what we talked about in domains and nodes. This is just a very high level overview. We do have, if you go through the documentation goes into details of the different domains, how it works internally, and as well as different services. But we're going to stick at a very high level because, like I said, the idea is to talk to you about how these, what makes up the platform, and how does the Informatica platform interact with the Hadoop cluster. Again, at a very high level, I can have one domain, and a domain can have multiple nodes. and each node, like I said, is a representation of a physical server. So in a grid architecture, I could have Informatica domain, I could have multiple nodes, again attached to multiple services. When we look at the application service, right? So this is the applications that run within the platform, right? These are functionalities, different functionalities within the platform, and each of these are configured through the Informatica administrator tool, and you have external clients that interact with these services, and these clients will be like the PowerCenter clients that most of you are familiar with, PowerCenter Designer, the Workflow Monitor, Repository Manager, and then you have the Developer tool, which is the primary tool that we will be working with in a big data management solution. I've highlighted some examples of what the services will look like. So again, PowerCenter, pretty much familiar with these services, right? The repository service, the integration service, the web services hub, metadata manager service, and then model repository integration service. What I've highlighted here in green and red is the services that we're going to be focusing on, because these services interact with the Hadoop cluster. So let's start by looking at the repository service, right? So PowerCenter repository and the model repository, these are multi-threaded processes that fetches, inserts, updates metadata within the repository database, right? So these are metadata of what your mapping looks like, what your workflow looks like, what your source metadata, how you're pulling from source, how you're extracting that data, transforming it, and then loading that data to their respective platforms, whether it's a data warehouse, whether it's a Hadoop cluster. Here you see that you have on the left PowerCenter clients, right? I talked about this at a high level. This interact with the PowerCenter repository service. Again, updating the metadata, fetching that metadata, storing the metadata, and in turn, internally, we have a PowerCenter repository service process that talks with the repository database. And as you can see, the repository database is outside of the Informatica domain, because these are actual database schemas or databases, whether it's a DB2, Oracle, SQL Server database, or what is supported right now. And then on the right, we have the model repository service. Again, the same concept applies, right? The idea is it's going to manage the process of fetching, inserting, updating metadata, storing that metadata, understanding how it's moving data, or how it's going to extract data from a source to target, right? And like I said, it's going to perform all the metadata transactions between the repository database and the repository clients. And then we do have the option to configure this as a high availability service. So whereby the repository service, in case of a failure, goes down, you can have a secondary repository service come up, right, in a purely HA high availability service standpoint. Okay, so high-level PowerCenter integration service, right? So this is what I consider the workhorse of the entire platform, because it defines how you're moving data. It actually does the data movement for you, right? Moves the data from source to target. You've got the concept of integration service, which can start or which starts the workflow, executes the workflow, manages the workflow. And then there's other concepts like data transformation manager, right? This is how it executes sessions and commands within a particular workflow, and it performs validations or performs tasks such as validating the workflows, creates the sessions, read writes data, handles all the pre-post operations. So here you've got a PowerCenter repository that's associated to a PowerCenter integration service. Again, this is in the context of the Informatica domain, right? So the PowerCenter repository is associated with the PowerCenter integration service in the context of the Informatica domain. Again, the PowerCenter, the repository database, is outside of the domain services. So the client tools interact with the repository, right? So I create a mapping, I build a mapping that gets stored in the repository. I use ODBC connectivity to fetch metadata, right? So when I build a mapping, I need to know what that structure looks like. So I'm going to import the metadata definitions, and typically that's done using ODBC connectivity. I build my mapping, the mapping gets stored in my repository. I build a workflow tells PowerCenter how it's going to move my data through sessions. I have a connectivity, right? So when I actually execute a mapping, the mapping will run on the PowerCenter integration service. The integration service will connect to my source, pull the data, and it'll connect using native drivers or ODBC, pull the data, transform the data, and then load the data to our target, right? So it could be, again, using either native drivers or we could use ODBC. And when you talk about native drivers, we're talking about, Oracle clients or DB2 clients, SQL Server clients that actually interact with the source or target databases. The one thing to note from a client perspective, you would use, or it uses TCP/IP to send requests to the integration service and the repository service. Remember, we don't interact directly with the repository database, meaning that the client tools don't interact directly with the repository database. The repository service talks to the database itself. Let's talk about the data integration service, right? So I'm not going to cover the model repository and the PowerCenter repository because I think we've kind of talked about that at high level, right? It just manages the metadata, stores the metadata, anything that you develop within your GUI tools, within your developer tools, I should say, you would have access to stores that metadata for you in the repository. So when I look at the developer tool, right? So the developer tool is primarily used for big data management mappings, right? Then we'll go through some labs, and like I said, you'll be using this tool a lot for big data development. So here, what the developer tool does, it's one developer tool, client tool that interacts with both the model repository service and the data integration service. So when you build a mapping in the developer client tool, that mapping is stored as metadata in the model repository. And again, like I said, your source, targets, profiling, any type of metadata you create within the developer tool is stored within the model repository service or stored in the repository database and is accessed using the model repository service. In the back end, model repository service, again, like I talked about in the last few slides, interacts with the repository database using native database drivers, right, or JDBC. And to interact with the data integration service, it communicates via TCP/IP, right? So scenario is I'm building my mapping, I connect my developer tool to the model repository, pull my mapping, and I'm about to execute this mapping workflow, and it's going to be executed on the DIS. DIS will talk to my source or extract from my source using native drivers, ODBC or JDBC, and load them to my targets, right? So again, database, fat files, any type of sources that it supports, and I'm going to load it to any target that it supports, right? Again, highlighted here is we'll use this primary client tool to develop artifacts for big data, and one of them is on the Hadoop platform. So what does this look like? So in the event, and we've done this at customer sites where I've had to configure all of these services, and this is what an architecture diagram would look like, right? So on the right hand side, we've got PowerCenter repository. It interacts with the integration service. It interacts with the PowerCenter web services hub and the reporting service. And then on the left hand side, we've got the model repository interacts with the data integration service. Within the data integration service, it's got different actual services, right? Profiling services, mapping services, SQL services. So to set up a platform, it's not an easy task, right? There's a lot of things that go into setting up a platform. that utilizes all these services that Informatica has to offer. And we're not going to go through all of these services because this is not the agenda of this course. We'll be primarily looking at what big data management, how big data management within the context of the platform is used with the Hadoop integration, right? If you're definitely interested in learning about these are you could go through the help guide. Help guides does a pretty good job of defining each of these services and how each of these services work. And then obviously Informatica University, where you can go through I believe it's the Informatica Administrator class, but you can check it out on their website there. But so what are we actually focusing on, right? So on what I did is, here's the entire platform. What are we focusing on? Obviously, the green checkbox is what we will be using primarily to build artifacts, to profile data, right, in big data sense. What's not covered in obviously as big data enablement is what's X'd out, right? So everything that you see in X is which is in X is what we are not going to be covering, right? So if you're interested again with these, take a look at the help guide or go over to the Informatica University webpage, and then I think they have classes defined for other types of services, right? Our focus is going to be purely on the data integration component for Hadoop. How do we use these services to interact with Hadoop, right? So again, what do we cover so far? We've covered the model repository, we've covered the data integration service, we've covered PowerCenter repository, PowerCenter integration service, and we'll walk through the administrative tool as well. And one thing that I did forget, right? So monitoring is also important here. I missed out, but think of it as another blob. If I scroll over to my screen here, and if you can see it, so here you see the administrative tool. So if there's another blob here for Informatica monitoring, that interacts with the domain, or that manages the services with the domain, right? So we'll be working with the monitoring tool as well, monitoring the health of the services, runtime statistics of mappings, workflows, profiles that we execute from the platform. Okay, so that covers very quick tour, I would say, of the Informatica platform. Again, like I mentioned, right, in the intro, and as I mentioned throughout the length of this course, the entire course, I'm not going to cover a lot of feature functionality of what the platform has to offer. This course is designed at a very high level to give you introduction to Informatica big data management, right? So we'll only be covering highlights of what some of these services. Okay, so let's take a look at Informatica big data management, PowerExchange for Hadoop. What PowerExchange for Hadoop is basically it consists of two adapters, right? And I talked about these adapters, which is PowerExchange for HDFS and PowerExchange for Hive. So when you see in your licensing tool, if you see PowerExchange for Hadoop, just know that these two, HDFS and Hive is part of that connectivity pack, right? So what does HDFS, what does PowerExchange for HDFS look like, right? So remember, in context of the Informatica domain, on the left hand side, right, we have PowerCenter service, and the way I'm going to work through the next few slides is on the left hand side you'll see PowerCenter services, on the right hand side you'll see Informatica platform services. And what I define as PowerCenter services is pretty straightforward. Any application service that is related to PowerCenter, right? So in this case, we're only going to be talking about PowerCenter repository, and we're going to be talking about the PowerCenter integration service. The Informatica platform service is where I consider the model repository and the data integration service. Okay, so from PowerCenter, how does PowerCenter work with Informatica, or How does PowerCenter work with the Hadoop cluster, right? So remember, the repository service has nothing to do with executing the job. The repository service is solely designed to manage, maintain metadata, right? Metadata being the objects that I created, mappings, workflows, defining sources, targets, connections, and so forth. It's the integration services that actually work or do most of the heavy lifting, right? So in terms of PowerExchange for HDFS, remember, PowerExchange for HDFS, you're only loading data to the Hadoop cluster. We're not processing data on the Hadoop cluster, and there's a key difference here, right? Loading data and processing. So when we talk about PowerExchange for HDFS, PowerExchange for Hive, we're loading data to these two data sources, right? So here with PowerCenter, again, focus on the left-hand side. PowerCenter integration service loads data to HDFS using a primary name node, right? So effectively, Informatica is using HDFS APIs to make these calls, right? So the integration service will say, hey, look, what's my name node URI? And you can specify it and your default port of 8020. PowerCenter integration service will make that call and load data to the name node, right? And we covered how the name node works in the Hadoop Basics module, where the name node decides where on the Hadoop cluster data is stored and how data is replicated, right? So PowerExchange from PowerCenter, we're just loading it talks to the name node goes and decides where we're going to store the data and how we're going to replicate the data and which data nodes we're going to replicate to. And if I switch over to the data integration service, it's the same thing, right? DIS is going to make the API calls to the Hadoop cluster using the HDFS, the Hadoop APIs, saying, hey, I have a file, I'm going to load this to Hadoop. Where's my name node? What's my port? I'm going to load data accordingly. And again, underneath the covers, Hadoop cluster will decide how it's going to, where it's going to store the data, and how it's going to replicate data, and so forth. Right? Okay, so very basic. That's PowerExchange for HDFS. So what is Hive? How is Hive different, right? So again, let's look at PowerCenter. PowerCenter integration service. It talks with the name node. The name node will, so let me backtrack here, right? So what PowerCenter does, again, it uses the Hadoop APIs, and it says, hey, I'm going to load data to Hadoop. So it'll load data to Hadoop using through the name node. And then we have a preprocessor that will, the post process will load data to Hive server. So indirectly, we're loading data to Hive via staging that data and then internally calling load commands to load to the Hive to a Hive table. DIS works differently. The DIS communicates directly to the Hive server too. And makes that call to say, hey, I'm going to load data to Hive table. What's my Hive server 2? What's my Hive server 2 connection, right? So typically it's like 10,000, a port on 10,000, running on port 10,000, and it's going to load that data directly to Hive. Now, what's the key difference here, right? So on the left-hand side, I've got this key, right? In PowerCenter, I only load to Hive, indirectly loading to Hive, right, through HDFS, and we stage the data, and Hive is gonna, and internally will load the data to Hive. Then we have the platform, the DIS, that has the ability to read data, right? Read data from Hive and load data to Hive, right? So there's a difference here. So you have to understand what that difference is and what PowerCenter can do and what the platform services can do, right? So again, quick recap. PowerCenter, I can load data to Hive, and the platform, the DIS, I can read data from Hive and I can write data to Hive. Okay, so we've talked about connectivity, right? Loading data to the data store, but how do we actually process data, right? Remember, PowerExchange gives you the capability of loading data to that particular store, right? So again, loading data to HDFS and to Hive. Now, what we do in big data management is we actually have the ability to leverage the distributed processing of Hadoop by executing the mapping on the Hadoop cluster. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about history. And this is a little important because it sets context to what we've done with version 10, right? So what did we do with version 9.6.1, right? So 9.6.0, 9.6.1, when it was first released, what Informatica allowed you to do was process data using the MapReduce framework. And the way we did that is that we take a mapping, right? So this is a mapping that you design using the developer tool, and you would execute that on a Hadoop cluster. And that Hadoop cluster could be of any size, right? It could be a 10 node cluster, 100 node, 500 node, 1000 node cluster. But what we're doing is that we're using Hive as our processing layer, right? So Informatica would submit the job to the Hadoop cluster, right? So Informatica, again, let me backtrack. So what Informatica did is take the mapping, it converts this mapping to Hive QL on the Informatica server. The Hive QL would have your Hive SQL statements that will run on the Hadoop cluster. It will take that optimized Hive QL and submit it to the Hadoop cluster, and you would have an option to run it through Hive on MapReduce or Hive on Tez, which is great for processing, right? So you would be able to support these two types of processing frameworks. If you take one step back, right? So you without Hive on Tez, right? So if you take Hive on Tez out of the equation and look at just the number 2, where we're just going and processing data on using MapReduce on the Hadoop cluster, this is what I would call like Hadoop 1.0, right? And in 1.0, you would have your processing framework and your resource management framework and distributed storage all in one context, right? Running as one service. And when Yarn came out, Yarn said, hey, look, let's separate the processing and the resource management capabilities of MapReduce into separate services, right? So if on the right-hand side, you'll see Hadoop 2.0, where you've got Yarn, which is yet another resource negotiator that manages the resources on the Hadoop cluster and separates the processing and the resource management capabilities, right? Now, when Yarn came about, that allowed the open source community to write different apps, right? And these apps or different processing engines, if you will. MapReduce was the first one that would allow that separated the resource management and processing capabilities. Then came Hive on Tez, and then Spark and so forth. So you've got multiple programming frameworks that can leverage your Hadoop cluster for distributed processing, just because of the ability of Yarn to manage the resources on that Hadoop cluster. So with 9.6.1, we were able to support Yarn as a processing, as a resource management for resource management, and then we'll also be able to support Hive on Tez. And what that allowed us to do was be able to create our own execution engine, right? So you have Informatica Big Data Management, which is what was released in November last year. Be able to process data on the Hadoop cluster, leveraging quite a bit of tools, right? Quite a bit of processing frameworks. So you've got Hive on MapReduce, Hive on Tez, and then Informatica Blaze. We'll talk about Blaze here in a second. But the idea was that now, as an end user, or as a production support personnel or administrator, you had multiple engines that you could support in context of processing big data on Hadoop, right? And then on the right hand side, we have a few other tools that came out during the same time that leverages Spark, right? So what Yarn did, right? This is truly to the power of Yarn, was be able to allow you to build different types of applications. And again, one of that applications that we've built internally was Informatica Blaze, which is we'll cover in depth here. But Blaze was the distributed processing engine for Hadoop. Now, what very high level, the way I think about Blaze is, if you're familiar with PowerCenter, right? The PowerCenter was used. The PowerCenter and the transformations it had was used to process data in parallel, right? So on one server scaling up, and the data transformation manager, right? So the DTM process that processes that data within the PowerCenter framework, could not scale distributedly. So what our engineers did was take the DTM engine and rewrite that application for distributed processing, right? So that's what how Blaze came about, right? So Blaze is basically a distributed processing engine for Hadoop, right? And again, we'll cover this in the next few slides. Well, actually, in the next module, I should say, in more detail. But the DTM engine is what would run on the Hadoop cluster, and with our support for quite a few transformations that we've built on the PowerCenter framework, now we'll be able to support that in the Hadoop cluster, because there's transformations that Hive on MapReduce wouldn't support, Hive on Tez couldn't support, or even Spark can't support, because these transformations are natively built for Informatica, right? Informatica PowerCenter, now for Informatica Blaze, and we'll talk in detail about that. So the next question is, so look, if I have BDM and Informatica BDM, how does Informatica Big Data Management support multiple languages, right? And if you think about Informatica BDM as a polyglot engine, right? Polyglot defined as being able to understand multiple languages. In our context here, you will be able to understand multiple languages and process this data in different types of languages. Right? So if I submit a mapping to process on Hadoop cluster, let's say, as an example, I'm reading Oracle data, or I'm reading Teradata data, and I'm going to load this to the Hadoop cluster, or I'm going to use the Hadoop cluster for processing. How does Informatica Big Data Management know which one of these processing engines that I want to support, right? Will it support Hive on MapReduce? Will it support Hive on Tez? Will it support Informatica Blaze? And also, Spark, because in 10.1 we support Spark. So how do we go about supporting all of this? I think this is one of the neatest features that we released with version 10 is the Smart Executor, right? Now, the Smart Executor was designed to dynamically determine which is the best processing engine to execute your workload, right? So at a very high level, let's say I have a mapping, I built a mapping reading from Oracle, doing some complex transformations, and I'm loading it to Hive or HDFS or whatever, right? What the Smart Executor will do, will decide, right? So there's optimizers that have been designed in there that will decide which is the best engine. So if I'm focusing on, okay, so let me go at a very high level, right? So the Smart Executor can run it, process the data on the Informatica server, right? So Informatica server, like we've known with the PowerCenter integration service, the data integration service, leveraging the service to process the data. Or if I'm on the processing data on the Hadoop cluster, you've got different engines that you can process data, or I can use the database pushdown option, right? So the Smart Executor is pretty well designed to decide at runtime which processing engine I want to run run my workload on. So if I look at just the Hadoop context, right, in the middle middle section here, right? I've got MapReduce, Hive on Test, Spark, and I've got Blaze. And in terms of running the data integration on Hadoop, Smart Executor will decide, say, hey, look, does this mapping, does this workload fit Hive on MapReduce? Does it fit Hive on Test? Does it can I execute faster on Spark? Can I execute faster on Blaze? Determine on that workload. So the platform, the data integration on Hadoop component of big data management allows you to process data process large amounts of data using any one of these supported processing frameworks, right? And dynamically deciding at runtime which is the best processing engine that you want to execute on. And the other advantage to this is from a design perspective, right? So it protects your future development from newer processing engines, right? And if you're following the Hadoop space carefully and on an ongoing basis, you'll know that every day there's, or not every day, but there are other projects out there in the ecosystem that are coming out as better and better processing engines, right? So Flink is one of them. Like I said, you've got Spark and so forth. So you've got plenty of these engines. So how would you decide which is the best processing engine, and how would you decide which engine that you want to process your data, right? So instead of hand coding and going from, let's say, MapReduce Java programming going to Spark, right? There's a conversion process. Here, what we're saying is, if I build my mapping once, I can leverage any of the supported processing, distributed processing engines to process my data, right? Again, I will definitely be talking more about Informatica Blaze and the Smart Executor in the next few modules. Okay, in terms of port connectivity, this is labeled as BDE, but it still applies for BDM. This is a very high level of how the platform Informatica server talks with the Hadoop cluster, right? So in green, you see how the Informatica server interacts with the cluster, right? So Informatica server will talk to the data nodes, where to push that data in terms of native processing, right? Otherwise, in terms of context, like I said, talked about, when you process data, you're actually going to process data on the Hadoop cluster. My clients, they interact with the Hive server, they interact with HBase, they interact with the name node. Why is that? And the reason is I'm going to import data, right? Remember, from a client perspective, when I develop a mapping, I still need to know how I'm going to source that data, what that source data looks like in terms of metadata, how I'm going to transform it, and where I'm going to load it to, right? So you need to bring in that metadata. Again, green box is when you're using for native processing, right? So native processing is if I'm going to use the Informatica server to process that data to the Hadoop cluster, right? So what that means is, again, let's go back to PowerExchange for Hadoop, right? Let's say that I've got small sets of data on SQL Server, Oracle DB2 that I'm going to source and I'm going to load to Hadoop cluster. Now, what I'll do is the Informatica server will make a call to the relational database, process the data on the Informatica server, and push that data to the Hadoop cluster. And when it pushes that data to the Hadoop cluster, it's using PowerExchange connectivity, right? And it interacts directly with the data nodes. Because remember, what happens, right, from a Hadoop perspective is the name node will tell Informatica, look, on data node 1, data node 2, data node 3, this is where you're going to store the data. And then internally, the name node will go decide how to replicate that data, right? So the Informatica server, in context of native mode of execution, is a client to the Hadoop cluster, right? You're getting information of where you're storing that data. And then finally, Hive pushdown, highlighted in yellow, right? What we talked about is when I have my Hadoop cluster running on when I have my workload running on the Hadoop cluster, Informatica submits the job to the Hadoop cluster, and internally, through the data node it'll make calls to SQL Server, the relational databases, bring that data onto the Hadoop cluster, process that data, and store that data, whether it's Hive server or Hive, HBase, or name node, right? So there's a lot of interaction that goes on with the Hadoop cluster, within the Hadoop cluster, with the Informatica server itself, and then with the Hadoop, with the Informatica clients. We will talk about port connectivity. We won't go into details of port because, as you can imagine, there's a number of ports within the Hadoop ecosystem itself, so within the Hadoop cluster itself, that you need to communicate with. But in the install config, we'll kind of go through high level what that looks like, what ports you would open, or what ports you need to interact with, right, at a very high level. Yeah, so in this one, again, just a high level connectivity, right? How in Informatica and how other client tools will interact with the Hadoop cluster. On the left, you'll look at is PowerCenter, right? So PowerCenter makes, this is actually, I should say, this is in context to Hive, right? In context to how Informatica Big Data talks with the Hadoop cluster when you're using Hive, right? So PowerCenter here talks with JDBC, right? So you'll set up your JDBC connectivity to your Hive server. Internal JDBC talks to the Hive server too through the Thrift client, right? So client and then interface, and submits the job to the Hive driver, where the Hive driver compiles, optimizes, and would execute the job, and that will be submitted to MapReduce Yarn to manage the job. And any metadata that is stored in the Metastore. Again, Metastore client talks with the Metastore database itself. And typically, right, MySQL is what I've seen at customer sites as their Metastore database, right? And then you have Beeline. Beeline talks to JDBC, same process. And then Hive CLI and Hive Web UI interact with the Hive driver directly. In terms of Informatica Big Data, right, we have, when you do an install, and this is for the administrator, so when they do the install, you will see that we package Hive drivers, right? So we package our own jar files that are related to the Hadoop distros that we support. So like I said, right, the Hive driver that we support, when I build my mapping, that mapping is converted to HiveQL, and this is all done within that Informatica BDE server. The Hive driver would compile, optimize that mapping, that workflow, or HiveQL, and submit it to the Yarn resource manager, and submit it to the Hive Metastore to process, right? So again, very high level of how Informatica BDM, Big Data Management, connects with the Hive server too, right? Okay, before we sign off, let me go through the client tool here. Let me walk through a quick demo of the Informatica platform and look at some of the connectivity that we had talked about here in this session. Okay, so here I've logged on to my Informatica environment on Azure, and I'll actually walk through this when I do my install config of what my environment looks like. So here's the Informatica administrator tool, right? So I log in, it's a web-based UI. I could either use HTTP or HTTPS, depending on how my administrator had configured it, to actually access the Informatica domain, right? So when I log on, I see the Informatica domain here, and I see all the services that I've configured. I didn't configure all. Well, I didn't configure all the services, but I've got most of the services up and running, right? So you'll see that I have my model repository. I've got my my data integration service, and I've got my PowerCenter repository, I've got my PowerCenter integration service. I disabled most of this because remember, services consume resources, and depending on how much memory, how much CPU you've allocated or you've purchased for your Informatica server, it does take up it does need a sizing exercise, right? So here I have a node, right? So I created a domain and I have associated with the node. My node is a logical representation of what my physical server would be, right? So I've got my host name. I tell it where different properties that I've set up. Again, there's a ton of properties. You can customize this, you can optimize this environment to your needs, but we're not going to go through each of them, right? So I've got my domain, I've got my node. My node has all these processes. If I go over the processes tab, these are all the processes that I've configured on my node. Now, in a grid setup, I could have a second node, I can have third node, I can have fourth node, and I can configure these services on each of those nodes. So in the event that one of these nodes, if my main node fails for whatever reason, it'll fail over to one of the other nodes that are active. But in this scenario, again, tutorial purposes, enablement purposes, I didn't want to set up a HA environment, right? So what I did is I've got a domain. I expand. Let's see if expand and expand. So I created these folders. Now, what I like to do is I typically create folders and I set up my services or assign the services to the folder, and it's just kind of way to organize my domain, because in a production sense you could have tons of these services running, right? So just a way to keep myself organized. So here I have a model repository, right? So if I click on the model repository service, using JDBC to connect to my database, I'm using an Oracle database. This is where I've stored my model repository metadata, right? So this is the repository service that I created. And this model repository service is associated with a DIS, right? Data Integration Service. If I go back, let me just go back to my repository. Notice I have backup nodes again. I can configure my model repository in HA. So if this repository service goes down, it'll fall back to whatever backup node I specified, and it'll continue working from there, right? And if I look at my DIS, I have in my DIS properties, I'll walk through some of these during the install config of what gets configured when I set up a Informatica BDM service, right? And then I can see different processes. I can look at the compute as well and look at the application. I've also configured Metadata Manager. We're not going to go through Metadata Manager, but again, it's a service that I've configured. And then again, PowerCenter, right? So PowerCenter repository service. Again, I can set it up as a HA. It's connecting to a repository database, InfoPCRS, and it's got an association with a PowerCenter integration service, right? So in context of what a domain is, right? Domain manages all the services within all the Informatica services in the platform, and application services are different applications that you use for different types of jobs, types of projects that you're working on, right? So very high level what a domain is and what the administrative tool looks like, and the different services that are associated with the within the domain itself. All right, so it's a very high level overview. Again, in the next module, we'll go through how we would monitor some of these processes that run on the Hadoop cluster. To wrap up, in this module, you should be able to describe what the Informatica platform is, describe connectivity to HDFS and to Hive, understand at a high level what the polyglot compute engine is, and then understand high level what the connectivity is between big data management and the Hadoop cluster.